25 years ago, I opened my door to find a trembling 2-year-old girl clutching a stuffed elephant, her tiny hand gripping a crumpled note that would change both our lives forever. That little girl was Emma, my ex-husband's secret daughter, from an affair I never knew existed. 10 years ago, David died of what everyone believed was a sudden heart attack at just 45 years old. Last Tuesday, Emma walked into my Portland home and told me the truth about why her father really died, and the revelation shattered everything I thought I knew about the man I once loved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the bay windows of my Hawthorne District home as I sat in my favorite reading chair, the same weathered leather seat where I'd spent countless hours helping Emma with homework, reading her bedtime stories, and later watching her transform from that frightened toddler into the confident woman she became. The irony wasn't lost on me that the child born from my marriage's destruction had become the greatest blessing of my life. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and at 52, I've learned that the most devastating betrayals often arrive disguised as ordinary Tuesday afternoons. I was grading papers when the doorbell rang that day 25 years ago, expecting perhaps a package delivery or a neighbor needing to borrow something trivial. Instead, I found myself staring down at a child who possessed David's unmistakable green eyes and stubborn chin, her dark hair matted, and her clothes clearly unwashed for days. The woman who delivered Emma introduced herself as a social worker, her expression professionally sympathetic, but hurried. The child's mother, Tony Chen, had died of an overdose 3 days earlier, and among her sparse belongings, they'd found documentation naming David Mitchell as the father, along with our home address scrawled on a piece of notebook paper. David was traveling for work, as he frequently was in those days, somewhere in eastern Oregon, finalizing a construction deal that he'd claimed was crucial for our financial future. I remember the surreal quality of that moment, standing in my doorway while a stranger explained that my husband had apparently fathered a child with another woman, a child who was now orphaned and in need of immediate placement. The social worker's words seemed to echo from a great distance as Emma peered up at me with those familiar eyes, her small fingers working nervously at the trunk of her stuffed elephant. What struck me most wasn't the anger, though that would come later. It was the recognition that flickered across Emma's face when she looked at me, as if she'd been waiting for this moment, as if she somehow knew I would be the one to save her. Perhaps children possess an intuition about safety that adults lose somewhere along the way, or perhaps she simply recognized the photographs David must have shown her during whatever secret visits he'd managed to arrange. The social worker explained the immediate options with bureaucratic efficiency. Emma could be placed in emergency foster care while they located other family members, or if I was willing, she could stay with us temporarily until David returned to sort out the legal arrangements. The choice should have been obvious, should have involved careful consideration and consultation with my husband, but looking down at that little girl who carried half of David's DNA and all of her own vulnerability, I heard myself saying she could stay. That decision, made in 30 seconds on my front porch, would reshape the next 25 years of my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. Emma stepped across the threshold, carrying nothing but her elephant and a small backpack containing 2 changes of clothes, a toothbrush with frayed bristles, and a composition notebook filled with her mother's handwriting. I would discover later that Tony had been documenting Emma's milestones, her first words and favorite foods, her fears and preferences, creating a roadmap for whoever might need to care for her daughter. The first 3 days before David returned were a crash course in instant motherhood. Emma was potty-trained but struggled with nightmares, speaking in whispered half-sentences when she spoke at all. She wouldn't eat anything green, cried if I left her sight for more than a few minutes, and had developed a habit of hiding small objects under the couch cushions, as if preparing for another sudden departure. I called in sick to my teaching job at Roosevelt Elementary, something I'd never done without genuine illness, and devoted myself entirely to helping Emma feel secure. We established routines, simple things like morning pancakes and afternoon story time, predictable rhythms that seemed to calm her perpetual vigilance. By the third evening, she was sleeping through the night, and I had fallen completely in love with this unexpected child who'd wandered into my carefully ordered life. David's return was everything I'd dreaded, and more. I heard his key in the lock just after 8 o'clock. Emma finally settled in the guest bedroom that had become her temporary sanctuary. His footsteps on the hardwood floor carried their usual confidence, the sound of a man accustomed to being welcomed home. I met him in the kitchen, where I'd been mindlessly organizing and reorganizing the contents of the junk drawer, my hands needing occupation while my mind processed the magnitude of what was about to unfold. He looked tired from his drive, his shirt wrinkled and his hair disheveled, already reaching for a beer from the refrigerator when he noticed my expression. The casual greeting died on his lips as he registered the tension in my posture, the way I stood with my arms crossed, blocking his usual path through the kitchen. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "About Emma." The color drained from his face so rapidly that for a moment I thought he might actually faint. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His beer remained unopened on the counter as he gripped the edge of the granite surface, his knuckles whitening with the pressure. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of secrets finally exposed to light. "Sarah, I can explain," he began, but I held up my hand to stop him. "She's upstairs," I said quietly. "Sleeping in the guest room. She's been here for 3 days." What followed was the longest night of our marriage, a marathon of confessions and recriminations that stripped away years of carefully maintained facades. David admitted to the affair with Tony, a relationship that had lasted nearly 6 months 3 years earlier. He claimed it had meant nothing, a cliché that felt particularly hollow given the sleeping child upstairs, who represented the very tangible consequences of his casual betrayal. The details emerged slowly, extracted through careful questioning and David's reluctant admissions. He had met Tony at a bar near one of his construction sites, attracted by her youth and the way she seemed impressed by his stories of business success. She was 22, working as a waitress while taking community college classes, dreaming of becoming a nurse. Their relationship had been purely physical, he insisted, conducted in cheap motels and her tiny apartment when I believed he was working late or traveling for business. When Tony discovered she was pregnant, she had contacted David, expecting some form of support or acknowledgement. Instead, he had pressured her to end the pregnancy, offering to pay for the procedure and promising to cover any related expenses. Tony had refused, determined to have the child, despite David's insistence that he wanted no part of parenthood with her. For the first 2 years of Emma's life, David had maintained minimal contact, sending sporadic cash payments through intermediaries and occasionally visiting when business supposedly brought him to Tony's neighborhood. He justified this distance by claiming Tony was unstable, prone to dramatic episodes, and unreasonable demands for more substantial support. The irony of his assessment would become clearer much later, when I understood the true dynamics of their relationship. Tony's death had apparently caught David completely off guard. He claimed to have learned about it only when the social worker's office contacted him, using information Tony had provided in case of emergency. His shock seemed genuine, but so did his immediate assumption that Emma would become someone else's responsibility, perhaps Tony's family or the foster care system. The idea that his daughter might come to live with us had never occurred to him, a failure of imagination that revealed the compartmentalized way he approached his various obligations. His work life, our marriage, his relationship with Tony, and his role as Emma's father existed in separate spheres that rarely intersected in his thinking. Now those spheres had collided catastrophically, and he seemed paralyzed by the need to integrate these different versions of himself. As dawn approached, we had established the basic facts but resolved nothing about our future. Emma was David's daughter, a reality that couldn't be changed or ignored. Tony was dead, leaving Emma without any other family willing or able to care for her. The Social Services Department expected a decision about permanent placement within the week, and David's name on the birth certificate made him legally responsible regardless of his preferences. What remained unclear was whether our marriage could survive this revelation, whether I could continue to love a man who had hidden such a fundamental betrayal, and most importantly, what would happen to Emma if we divorced. The complexity of the situation felt overwhelming, too many variables and consequences to process in a single conversation. David pleaded for understanding, for time to figure out how to make things right. He promised complete transparency going forward, swore that his relationship with Tony had been his only infidelity, and begged me to consider the possibility of starting fresh with full honesty between us. His remorse seemed genuine, but so did his obvious discomfort with the prospect of suddenly becoming a full-time father to a toddler he barely knew. I found myself in an impossible position, faced with a choice that would determine not just my own future but Emma's as well. If I left David, as every instinct urged me to do, Emma would likely end up in foster care, or back with social services, passed between strangers who couldn't provide the stability she desperately needed. If I stayed, I would be accepting not just David's betrayal but the permanent presence of its most visible reminder. But as I climbed the stairs to check on Emma that morning, finding her curled in the center of the guest bed with her elephant tucked securely under her arm, the choice became surprisingly clear. This child had already lost her mother and been abandoned by her father's indifference. She had experienced more trauma in her 2 years than many children face in their entire lives. I couldn't bear the thought of adding another loss to her young life. I decided to stay, not for David, but for Emma. I would raise his daughter as my own, provide the loving home she deserved, and create the family that David's selfishness had nearly destroyed. The marriage might not survive, that remained to be seen, but Emma would never again question whether she was wanted, whether she belonged, whether someone would fight for her. That decision, made in the early morning light while watching a 2-year-old sleep peacefully for perhaps the first time in weeks, set the course for everything that followed. I had no way of knowing that my choice to protect Emma would eventually lead to discoveries that would redefine everything I thought I knew about David, about our marriage, and about the true reasons behind the tragedy that had brought Emma into our lives. The next 15 years would test my commitment to that decision in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Through David's continued struggles with fatherhood, the eventual dissolution of our marriage, and the gradual revelation that Tony's death might not have been the simple overdose everyone assumed. But in that moment, watching Emma sleep with the innocent trust of a child who had finally found safety, I knew I had made the only choice my conscience would allow. Emma stirred slightly, her hand reaching out as if checking that her elephant remained within reach, and I felt a fierce protectiveness settle over me like armor. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever secrets remained hidden, whatever price I might pay for my decision, I would ensure that this child grew up knowing she was loved unconditionally. I had become Emma's mother by choice rather than biology, but the bond forming between us felt as real and powerful as any family connection forged by blood. David might have created this situation through his betrayal, but I would shape its resolution through my love. The little girl who had arrived on my doorstep as evidence of my husband's deception would become the greatest gift of my life, though it would take 25 years to fully understand the magnitude of that gift. Standing in that doorway, I couldn't have imagined that one day Emma would return to me as an adult, carrying information that would finally explain the mysterious circumstances of her father's death. I couldn't have foreseen that the child I was protecting would one day become my protector, revealing truths that would vindicate decisions I'd questioned for decades. But perhaps the most important truth was already evident in that quiet moment. Love has the power to transform even the most devastating betrayals into unexpected blessings, and sometimes the family we choose becomes more precious than the one we were born into. Emma had chosen me just as surely as I had chosen her, and together we would navigate whatever revelations awaited us in the years to come. The morning after my decision to keep Emma permanently marked the beginning of what I now think of as our foundation years. I woke before dawn, a habit that would persist for months as my subconscious remained alert for Emma's potential nightmares or needs. The house felt different somehow, charged with new purpose and responsibility that both thrilled and terrified me in equal measure. Emma was still sleeping when I crept downstairs to make coffee, her breathing steady and peaceful in a way that filled me with quiet satisfaction. David had left early for his office, claiming urgent meetings that couldn't be postponed, though I suspected he simply needed space to process the seismic shift our lives had undergone. His discomfort around Emma was palpable, a nervous energy that manifested in awkward attempts at conversation and an obvious relief when she focused her attention elsewhere. I called Roosevelt Elementary again, this time to request a full week of personal leave. Principal Morrison's questions were gentle but persistent, and I found myself crafting careful half-truths about a family emergency that required my immediate attention. The irony wasn't lost on me that my teaching career, built on honesty and nurturing young minds, now required strategic omissions to protect the young mind that had suddenly become my primary concern. Emma emerged from her room just after 8, padding down the stairs in the cotton pajamas I'd hastily purchased during a late-night Target run. Her hair stuck up at impossible angles, and she clutched her elephant with the fierce grip of someone who understood the temporary nature of comfort. She paused at the kitchen threshold, her green eyes scanning the room as if checking for changes that might signal another upheaval. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice soft and steady. "Are you hungry? I was thinking we could make pancakes together." Her nod was almost imperceptible, but she approached the kitchen island where I'd already assembled ingredients, her bare feet silent on the cool tile floor. Cooking together became our first real bonding activity, Emma standing on a sturdy step stool, while I guided her small hands in measuring flour and cracking eggs. Her concentration was intense, as if the precision of following a recipe provided a framework for understanding this new world she'd entered. The pancakes were slightly lumpy and unevenly shaped, but Emma's pride in her contribution was unmistakable. She ate with the focused determination of a child who'd learned not to take meals for granted, cleaning her plate completely before asking in her whispered voice if she could save one pancake for her elephant. The request broke my heart and charmed me simultaneously, revealing both her capacity for imagination and her instinct to share even limited resources. Those first weeks established patterns that would sustain us through much more difficult periods ahead. Morning pancakes became sacred ritual, followed by educational activities disguised as play. Emma was bright, absorbing new information with startling speed, but her learning had obvious gaps that suggested inconsistent early childhood experiences. She could count to 20, but didn't know basic colors. She recognized several letters but had never been read to regularly. She understood complex emotional concepts, but struggled with simple social interactions. I threw myself into filling these gaps with the passionate dedication I'd always brought to my most challenging students. We spent hours with picture books, Emma gradually relaxing into the rhythm of shared reading. We practiced writing letters in sandbox sand, painted watercolor rainbows while learning color names, and played counting games, with everything from Cheerios to sidewalk cracks. Her progress was remarkable, fueled by an eagerness to please that sometimes worried me with its intensity. David's relationship with Emma remained complicated and painful to witness. He tried, I'll give him credit for that, but his efforts carried the forced quality of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than expressing genuine affection. He brought her small gifts after business trips, toys selected with little understanding of her interests or developmental needs. He attempted bedtime stories but stumbled over simple children's books, his natural impatience surfacing when Emma asked questions or requested repetition. Most heartbreaking were Emma's attempts to win his approval, the way she would present her artwork for his inspection, or try to engage him in games she'd mastered. David's responses, while not unkind, carried a distracted quality that Emma seemed to sense instinctively. She began directing most of her questions and accomplishments toward me, gradually accepting that her father's attention was sporadic and unreliable. The legal aspects of Emma's placement required navigation through bureaucratic mazes that would have challenged someone with significantly more experience than I possessed. David's paternity was established through DNA testing, a process that involved multiple appointments and paperwork that seemed designed to discourage, rather than facilitate, family reunification. The social worker assigned to our case, Mrs. Rodriguez, proved to be both thorough and surprisingly compassionate, recognizing that Emma's attachment to me was developing into something precious and worth protecting. Our home study was scheduled for 6 weeks after Emma's arrival, giving us time to establish routines and demonstrate our capacity to provide stable care. I prepared obsessively, researching best practices for child safety and educational enrichment, transforming our house into what I hoped appeared to be an ideal environment for raising a toddler. I installed safety latches on cabinets, added outlet covers and cabinet locks, and created dedicated spaces for Emma's belongings that would signal her permanent status in our home. The day of the home study, Mrs. Rodriguez arrived with a clipboard and kind eyes, spending nearly 3 hours observing our interactions and asking detailed questions about our plans for Emma's future. David had taken the afternoon off work, one of the few times he'd prioritized Emma's needs over his professional obligations. His nervousness was evident, but he managed to present a convincing image of committed fatherhood, answering questions about childcare philosophy and educational goals, with responses I suspected he'd rehearsed. Emma performed beautifully, demonstrating the security and happiness she'd developed over the past month and a half. She showed Mrs. Rodriguez her room, now fully decorated with age-appropriate furniture and toys, and proudly displayed artwork we'd created together that now covered one wall of the kitchen. Her comfort level was obvious, the way she moved through the house with ownership, and brought her favorite books for the social worker to admire. The approval came 2 weeks later, along with information about support services and regular check-ins that would continue for the next year. Emma was officially ours, legally and practically, though emotionally she'd been mine since that first night when she'd fallen asleep holding my hand. The paperwork felt anticlimactic after the intensity of uncertainty we'd navigated, but it provided the security I needed to begin planning for Emma's long-term future. My return to teaching after extended leave required careful coordination with the school administration and honest conversations with colleagues who'd noticed my absence. I crafted a simplified version of our story, explaining that David and I had taken in his daughter following her mother's death, presenting it as a planned adoption rather than the crisis intervention it had actually been. The support from my fellow teachers was overwhelming, colleagues offering everything from childcare advice to hand-me-down clothing and toys. Emma's adjustment to daycare while I worked proved challenging initially. She'd grown accustomed to having my undivided attention, and the prospect of spending 8 hours with strangers triggered regression in some of the progress we'd made. The first few mornings involved tears and clinging that broke my heart, but the daycare staff at Little Sprouts proved to be experienced with children who'd experienced trauma. They developed special strategies for helping Emma feel secure, including a photo album of our family that she could look at whenever she missed me. Gradually, Emma began to thrive in the structured environment of daycare, making friends with other children and developing independence that had been suppressed during her early years with Tony. Her teachers reported that she was particularly drawn to activities involving care for others, often comforting classmates who were upset or helping younger children with challenging tasks. This nurturing instinct would become one of her defining characteristics, a strength born from her early understanding of vulnerability. David's work increasingly took him away from home during this period, a pattern that I initially attributed to seasonal demands in the construction industry, but gradually recognized as intentional avoidance. His discomfort with domestic life had intensified rather than diminished over time, and Emma's presence seemed to highlight everything he found constraining about family obligations. He provided financial support without complaint, but his emotional investment remained minimal and sporadic. Our marriage began showing strain in ways that went beyond the obvious trauma of his infidelity. David had expected life to return to normal once Emma's placement was settled, assuming that her presence would gradually fade into background routine, rather than fundamentally altering our daily rhythms. He seemed frustrated by the way conversations now revolved around Emma's needs, the way spontaneous plans were no longer possible, the way our relationship had necessarily shifted to accommodate the needs of a child. I found myself protecting Emma from David's emotional distance, making excuses for his absences and compensating for his lack of engagement with extra attention and affection. This dynamic was exhausting and ultimately unsustainable, creating resentment that I struggled to acknowledge even to myself. I loved Emma completely, but I was beginning to understand that raising her as a single parent while maintaining the fiction of an intact marriage was taking a toll on my emotional and physical well-being. The first major crisis came when Emma was 4, during what should have been a celebratory weekend marking 2 years since she'd joined our family. David had promised to take her to the zoo, a rare initiative on his part that had generated days of excited anticipation. Emma had prepared for the outing, with the thoroughness she brought to everything important, selecting her outfit and packing a small backpack with snacks and her camera. When David canceled at the last minute due to an urgent work call, Emma's devastation was profound and heartbreaking. She didn't cry or throw a tantrum, responses that might have been easier to handle. Instead, she retreated into herself, accepting the disappointment with a resignation that revealed how familiar such letdowns had become. Her quiet acceptance was more devastating than anger would have been, evidence that she was learning not to expect reliability from her father. I took her to the zoo myself, of course, and we had a wonderful day, despite the circumstances. Emma's resilience amazed me. Her ability to recover joy and excitement, once she understood that our plans would proceed, regardless of David's absence. But that evening, after she'd fallen asleep surrounded by the stuffed animals we'd purchased, and the photos we'd taken, I sat in our living room confronting the unsustainable nature of our family dynamic. David returned home just after midnight, expecting to find me asleep and the incident forgotten. Instead, he found me waiting with a bottle of wine and a determination to address the patterns that were becoming increasingly harmful to Emma's emotional development. The conversation that followed was difficult, but necessary, forcing us both to acknowledge that his relationship with Emma wasn't improving over time as we'd hoped. His honesty was brutal but ultimately clarifying. He admitted that he'd never wanted children, that Emma's presence reminded him daily of choices he regretted and responsibilities he'd never sought. He loved her in the abstract way he might love a distant relative, but he couldn't access the deep parental connection that seemed to come naturally to me. His guilt about these feelings only intensified his avoidance, creating a cycle that was becoming increasingly destructive for all of us. I listened without judgment, recognizing that his struggles weren't entirely selfish but reflected genuine incompatibility between his personality and the demands of active fatherhood. Some people are naturally suited to nurturing children, while others find the constant needs and emotional intensity overwhelming. David fell clearly into the latter category, and pretending otherwise was serving no one's interests. That conversation marked the beginning of a gradual shift in our family structure, an acknowledgement that Emma's primary parent would be me, while David provided financial support and occasional involvement when his schedule and emotional capacity allowed. This arrangement wasn't ideal, but it was honest, and it eliminated the disappointment cycle that had been so damaging to Emma's sense of security. Over the following months, Emma adapted to this new reality with characteristic resilience. She stopped asking when Daddy would be home, stopped planning activities that required his participation, and instead focused her energy on the relationship that provided consistent love and attention. Our bond deepened further, developing into something that transcended the circumstances of our initial connection. My own evolution during this period was equally significant. I discovered reserves of strength and patience I hadn't known I possessed, along with a fierce protectiveness that redefined my understanding of love. Emma brought out qualities in me that had been dormant during my childless years, nurturing instincts and creative problem-solving abilities that enriched my life immeasurably. The support system I built around Emma and myself became crucial to our success. Linda Hayes, my closest friend and a nurse practitioner at the local pediatric clinic, became Emma's unofficial aunt and my primary source of parenting advice. Linda's own children were older, and she welcomed the opportunity to be involved with the young child again. Her medical background proved invaluable when Emma faced normal childhood illnesses and injuries, but her emotional support was even more precious. We established traditions that belonged exclusively to Emma and me, weekend adventures and holiday rituals that created positive associations with our unconventional family structure. Emma learned to see our household as complete rather than lacking, understanding that families came in many configurations and that love was more important than traditional structures. Her language development accelerated dramatically during this period, fueled by constant conversation and the security that allowed her personality to emerge fully. She revealed herself to be curious about everything, asking complex questions about how things worked and why people behaved in certain ways. Her empathy was remarkable for such a young child, always concerned about others' feelings and quick to offer comfort when someone seemed distressed. Emma's artistic abilities also flourished, encouraged by unlimited access to art supplies and enthusiastic appreciation for every creation. Our refrigerator became a gallery of her work, and I started keeping special pieces in a portfolio that documented her creative development. She showed particular talent for drawing faces, capturing expressions with surprising accuracy and emotional depth. The neighborhood where we lived proved to be ideal for raising a young child, full of families with children and safe streets perfect for bike riding and outdoor play. Emma made friends easily, her warm personality and inclusive nature making her popular with other children. Playdates and birthday parties became regular features of our social calendar, normal childhood experiences that helped Emma understand her place in the larger community. School readiness became a focus as Emma approached kindergarten age. Her intellectual development was clearly advanced, but her social skills needed refinement after years of primarily adult interaction. We enrolled her in a preschool program designed to help children develop independence and peer relationships, another step in preparing her for the broader world beyond our protective household. The preschool experience revealed Emma's natural leadership abilities and her instinct to help other children who were struggling. Her teachers reported that she often served as a mediator during conflicts and showed unusual sensitivity to classmates who seemed lonely or upset. These qualities, born from her own early experiences with loss and displacement, would become defining characteristics throughout her life. As Emma's 5th birthday approached, I realized that the chaotic circumstances of her arrival had transformed into something precious and purposeful. The child who had represented the destruction of my marriage had become the center of a new kind of family, one built on choice rather than obligation, on love rather than duty. Our unconventional beginning had led to an authentically beautiful relationship that enriched both our lives immeasurably. David's role continued to evolve, settling into that of a distant but financially supportive father who appeared for major events and holidays but remained peripheral to Emma's daily life. This arrangement allowed him to contribute, without the pressure of constant involvement, while protecting Emma from the disappointment of unmet expectations. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional and honest about everyone's capabilities and limitations. The foundation we built during those crucial early years would prove essential when facing the challenges that lay ahead. Emma's security in my love gave her the confidence to navigate future uncertainties, while my own growth as a parent prepared me for decisions that would test every principle I'd developed about family, loyalty, and truth. We had created something strong enough to withstand whatever revelations awaited us, though neither of us could have imagined how thoroughly those revelations would reshape our understanding of the past and our hopes for the future. Emma's 6th birthday party was the last time our family appeared whole to the outside world. I'd spent weeks planning the perfect celebration, transforming our backyard into a fairy tale wonderland, complete with twinkling lights, handmade decorations, and a treasure hunt that would challenge her growing intellect. 20 children from her kindergarten class attended, along with their parents who had become my social circle over the years of school events and playdates. David made an effort that day, arriving home early with an elaborate dollhouse he'd commissioned from a local craftsman. Emma's joy was genuine but measured, the response of a child who had learned not to invest too heavily in gestures that might not be repeated. She thanked him politely and immediately began showing her friends the intricate details of the miniature furniture, but I noticed how quickly she moved on to other activities, how she didn't linger in the moment of receiving his attention. The other parents commented on what a lovely family we seemed, how lucky Emma was to have such devoted parents, how well-adjusted she appeared despite her unconventional beginning. I smiled and accepted their compliments while internally cataloging the ways our picture-perfect afternoon diverged from our daily reality. David disappeared into his home office halfway through the party, claiming an urgent call that couldn't wait. Emma barely noticed his absence, too absorbed in her friends and festivities to track his movements. That evening, after the guests had departed and Emma had fallen asleep surrounded by her new treasures, I found myself sitting in our kitchen contemplating the growing chasm between perception and reality in our household. The performance of family harmony was becoming increasingly exhausting, requiring constant vigilance to maintain appearances while protecting Emma from the truth of David's emotional unavailability. The conversation I'd been avoiding finally erupted 3 weeks later, triggered by a seemingly minor incident that revealed the deeper fractures in our marriage. Emma had been invited to a birthday sleepover, her first overnight stay away from home, and she was both excited and nervous about the adventure. David's response to the invitation was immediate and dismissive, declaring that 6 was too young for sleepovers, and that Emma needed to learn to be content with what she had at home. His pronouncement caught me off guard, not because of the content, but because of his assumption that he could make unilateral decisions about Emma's social development, after years of minimal involvement in her daily life. When I questioned his reasoning, explaining that the host family was well known to us and that Emma had been looking forward to this milestone for weeks, his irritation flared into something uglier. "You've spoiled her," he said, his voice carrying the accumulated frustration of years of feeling like an outsider in his own home. "She expects constant entertainment, constant attention. Normal children don't need elaborate parties and special accommodations for every little thing." The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be cutting. I had perhaps overcompensated for his absence by being hyper-attentive to Emma's needs, creating a rich environment of activities and experiences that filled the gaps his disengagement had left. But the implication that my love was somehow harmful, that my dedication was creating problems rather than solving them, ignited a defensive anger I'd been suppressing for months. "Normal children," I replied carefully, "have fathers who show up consistently, who remember their preferences and participate in their development. Emma has learned to find security where she can get it, which happens to be with me." The argument that followed was our most honest exchange in years, stripping away the polite accommodations we'd maintained for Emma's sake and exposing the fundamental incompatibility that had been growing beneath the surface. David felt trapped by responsibilities he'd never wanted, resentful of the way Emma's presence had permanently altered the trajectory of our marriage. I felt abandoned by a partner who'd left me to handle the most important work of our relationship alone, while he pursued the comfortable distance of his professional obligations. More painful than his resentment was his admission that he often forgot Emma existed when he was away from home, that she felt like someone else's child who happened to live in his house. The honesty was brutal but clarifying, confirming what I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Emma's arrival had revealed something essential about David's character, his capacity for compartmentalization that allowed him to disconnect from inconvenient emotions and obligations. We agreed that night to begin couples counseling, a last attempt to find a way forward that would serve everyone's needs. Dr. Patricia Reeves came highly recommended by Linda, who'd worked with her professionally and vouched for her expertise with blended families and adoption trauma. Our first session was scheduled for the following Thursday, contingent on David's ability to adjust his travel schedule. He canceled 15 minutes before our appointment, claiming an emergency at a construction site that required his immediate attention. The pattern repeated itself twice more before I finally attended a session alone, seeking guidance for decisions that felt too weighty to make without professional input. Dr. Reeves' questions were gentle but penetrating, forcing me to confront the possibility that our marriage might be beyond repair, and to consider what that would mean for Emma's future. The revelation that changed everything came not through counseling or confrontation, but through a chance discovery that illuminated years of carefully concealed deception. Emma had developed a fascination with family photos, often requesting to look through albums that documented her integration into our household. She particularly enjoyed the pictures from her early years with us, studying them with the intensity of someone trying to understand her own history. During one of these photo sessions, she asked about pictures of her mother, wondering what Tony had looked like and whether they shared any physical similarities. I realized with a shock that I had no photographs of Tony, had never thought to request any from the social services department, and had never asked David if he possessed any mementos from their relationship. Emma's curiosity sparked my own, leading me to search through David's belongings for any trace of the woman who had given birth to the child I now considered my daughter. The search began innocently, focused on finding something tangible to help Emma understand her origins. David's home office had always been off-limits, his private domain where he handled business affairs and personal correspondence without interference. But with him away on another extended trip, I decided to look through his files for any documentation related to Emma's birth or Tony's death that might contain useful information. What I found in the locked drawer of his filing cabinet wasn't a photograph or birth certificate, but a manila folder containing correspondence that revealed a completely different version of the story David had told me about his relationship with Tony. The letters, written in Tony's careful handwriting, painted a picture of a woman who was neither unstable nor unreasonable, but desperate and increasingly frightened as her situation became more precarious. The earliest letters, dated during Tony's pregnancy, were formal requests for support, carefully worded appeals for help with medical expenses, and basic necessities. David's typed responses, carbon copies stored with her originals, were coldly legalistic, acknowledging paternity, while limiting his financial responsibility to minimal amounts paid through third parties. The tone was that of a businessman managing a liability rather than a partner supporting the mother of his child. As Emma's birth approached, Tony's letters became more personal and pleading, describing her fear of raising a child alone without adequate resources or family support. She wasn't asking David to leave his wife or claim their daughter publicly, only to provide enough assistance to ensure basic stability. His responses remained detached and minimal, offering occasional small payments while making clear that he considered their relationship concluded and his obligations limited. The most disturbing letters were written after Emma's birth, when Tony's desperation intensified as she struggled with the demands of single motherhood while working multiple low-paying jobs. She described Emma's development in loving detail, sharing milestones and expressing hope that David might want to be more involved in their daughter's life. Her requests for additional support were accompanied by photographs of Emma, pictures that showed a chubby, happy baby who strongly resembled David. David's responses to these letters revealed a calculated cruelty that shocked me with its methodical indifference. He questioned Tony's claims about Emma's paternity, despite the obvious physical resemblance, suggested that other men might be responsible for her pregnancy, and threatened to cease all financial support if she continued to, quote, harass him with requests for increased assistance. His language became increasingly harsh as Tony's situation became more desperate. The final letters in the collection painted a picture of a young woman in crisis, struggling with postpartum depression, mounting debts, and the exhaustion of caring for a toddler while working multiple jobs to pay rent. Tony's handwriting became less careful, her sentences more fragmented as she described her growing reliance on alcohol and prescription medications to cope with the overwhelming stress of her situation. She begged David to consider taking Emma if something happened to her, expressing fear that she wasn't capable of providing the stability her daughter deserved. David's last response was a single typed paragraph denying any responsibility for Tony's choices and warning her that further contact would result in legal action. The letter was dated 6 months before Tony's death, suggesting that he had cut off all communication during the period when she needed support most desperately. There was no evidence that he had responded to her final pleas or shown any concern for either her welfare or Emma's future. Reading these letters in the silence of David's office, surrounded by the evidence of his prosperous life while Tony struggled in poverty with their daughter, I felt a cold fury settle over me like a shroud. This wasn't the story of a casual affair with an unstable woman that David had portrayed. This was systematic abandonment of a vulnerable young mother and deliberate neglect of a helpless child, a pattern of cruelty that revealed depths of selfishness I hadn't imagined him capable of. The implications extended far beyond my marriage to encompass everything I thought I knew about the man I'd lived with for nearly a decade. If David could maintain such cold indifference toward his own daughter's welfare, if he could stand by while Tony spiraled into the desperation that ultimately led to her death, what other capacities for callousness might he possess? The revelation forced me to reevaluate not just our relationship, but David's fundamental character. I photographed every letter before returning them to their hiding place, creating a record that would prove crucial in the legal proceedings I now knew were inevitable. The marriage had been over since the moment David chose to abandon Tony and Emma, rather than accept responsibility for his actions. My remaining task was to protect Emma from the consequences of her father's choices, while ensuring that she would never suffer the kind of abandonment that had destroyed her mother. The confrontation with David upon his return was unlike any conversation we'd ever had, stripped of the diplomatic courtesy that had characterized even our worst arguments. I presented him with copies of the letters, watching his face transform from confusion to recognition, to something approaching panic as he realized the extent of his exposure. His attempts at explanation and justification only deepened my disgust, revealing the elaborate self-deception he'd constructed to avoid acknowledging his role in Tony's downward spiral. He claimed that Tony had been manipulative, that her letters exaggerated her situation to extract more money, that her addiction problems predated their relationship and weren't his responsibility. His version of events painted him as the victim of an unstable woman's schemes, a narrative that required ignoring the evidence of his own written responses and the devastating consequences of his abandonment. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain such delusions revealed a capacity for self-justification that made honest relationship impossible. When I told him I was filing for divorce, his response was immediate threats about custody and financial support, warnings that he could make life difficult for both Emma and me if I chose to make our separation contentious. The irony of his sudden concern for parental rights after years of indifference would have been laughable if the stakes weren't so serious. His transformation from absent father to protective parent lasted exactly as long as it took him to realize that divorce would require actual involvement in Emma's life. The legal proceedings began the following week, with me represented by Catherine Sullivan, a family law attorney Linda had recommended, who specialized in cases involving adoption and parental rights. Catherine's assessment of our situation was cautiously optimistic, noting that David's documented absence from Emma's daily life would weigh heavily in custody determinations, but warning that his financial resources could complicate settlement negotiations. David's attorney was Marcus Webb, a notorious advocate for wealthy men seeking to minimize support obligations while maintaining control over family decisions. Webb's strategy became apparent immediately, focusing on my alienation of Emma from her father and my unstable decision to take in a child without proper consideration of the marriage impact. The narrative painted me as an impulsive woman who had destroyed a happy family by insisting on keeping a child that belonged in foster care. The custody evaluation required extensive interviews with court-appointed psychologists, home visits, and detailed documentation of our family routines and relationships. Emma, now 7 years old, was deemed mature enough to express preferences about living arrangements, though her input would be weighted against professional assessments of her best interests. Her attachment to me was obvious and profound, but David's legal team worked to characterize this bond as unhealthy dependence rather than natural parent-child connection. Throughout these proceedings, Emma remained my primary concern, though she couldn't be completely shielded from the tension and uncertainty that pervaded our household. I maintained our routines as much as possible, ensuring that her school performance and social relationships continued uninterrupted, while dealing with the emotional and logistical demands of divorce litigation. Her resilience amazed me daily, her ability to find joy and security despite the adult chaos swirling around her. The most challenging aspect of the divorce was David's attempt to use Emma as leverage in financial negotiations, threatening to pursue full custody if I didn't agree to minimal support payments. His sudden interest in fatherhood was transparently strategic, but the legal system required that his claims be taken seriously regardless of motivation. The possibility that Emma might be forced to live with a father who viewed her as a bargaining chip created an urgency that colored every decision I made. Catherine's strategy focused on documented evidence of David's long-term absence from Emma's life, the pattern of neglect that had characterized his relationship with both Tony and Emma, and expert testimony about the psychological impact of disrupting a child's primary attachment. We built a comprehensive case demonstrating that Emma's welfare required stability and continuity, elements that could only be provided through my primary custody. The breakthrough came when Catherine's investigation team discovered additional documentation of David's abandonment of Tony, including medical records showing that he'd been listed as emergency contact but had failed to respond when Tony was hospitalized during a severe depressive episode 6 months before her death. The records painted a picture of systematic negligence that undermined his claims of responsible fatherhood and revealed the true extent of his callousness toward both mother and child. Faced with evidence that would likely result in supervised visitation at best, David agreed to a settlement that granted me full custody with minimal visitation rights for him. The financial terms were reasonable rather than generous, but they provided enough security to ensure Emma's future educational and living expenses would be covered. More importantly, the agreement included provisions limiting David's ability to disrupt Emma's life or challenge custody arrangements without compelling evidence of changed circumstances. The divorce was finalized on a gray Tuesday morning in November, exactly 18 months after I'd discovered the letters that revealed David's true character. Emma was in school, unaware that this particular day marked the legal end of our unconventional family structure and the beginning of our new life as an officially single-parent household. The relief I felt walking out of the courthouse was profound and liberating, the end of years of pretending that our marriage was salvageable, or that David's relationship with Emma could be fixed through time and patience. That evening, I explained to Emma that Daddy would no longer be living with us, using age-appropriate language that emphasized the permanence of our bond while acknowledging the changes in our family structure. Her response was pragmatic and surprisingly mature, asking practical questions about whether she could still see him sometimes, and whether our house and routines would stay the same. The absence of distress in her reaction confirmed what I'd suspected, that David's departure represented relief rather than loss for a child who had long ago stopped expecting emotional support from him. The first year as an officially single parent brought challenges I hadn't anticipated, but also freedoms that transformed our daily life in wonderful ways. Without the need to accommodate David's schedule and preferences, Emma and I developed new traditions and explored interests that had been suppressed during the years of marital tension. We took weekend trips to museums and national parks, hosted elaborate tea parties for her stuffed animals, and spent lazy Saturday mornings reading in bed without worrying about disturbing anyone else's plans. Emma flourished in this environment of complete attention and consistent affection, her personality expanding to fill the space that David's emotional absence had created. Her academic performance improved markedly, and her social confidence grew as she internalized the security of knowing that her primary caregiver would always prioritize her needs. The transformation was remarkable to witness, confirmation that the difficult decision to end my marriage had been not just right but essential for Emma's healthy development. David's visits, scheduled for every other weekend, were sporadic and increasingly brief, as his interest in active parenting proved to be as limited as I'd expected. Emma adapted to his inconsistency with characteristic resilience, making backup plans for weekends when he canceled, and learning not to invest too heavily in activities that required his participation. His apartment became a place she visited rather than a second home, another confirmation that their relationship lacked the fundamental connection necessary for meaningful parent-child bonds. The most significant development during this period was Emma's growing curiosity about her mother and the circumstances that had brought her into our family. Her questions became more sophisticated as her understanding of family structures expanded through school discussions and exposure to classmates' diverse living situations. She wanted to know why Tony had died, whether her mother had loved her, and what might have happened if Tony had lived to raise her. These conversations required careful navigation between honesty and age-appropriate information, balancing Emma's need to understand her origins with the necessity of protecting her from details that might be traumatic or confusing. I shared what I could about Tony's love for her, using the evidence from the letters to paint a picture of a young woman who had wanted the best for her daughter even when she couldn't provide it herself. The story of Tony's struggles with depression and addiction would wait until Emma was mature enough to understand the complexities of mental health and substance abuse. As Emma's 8th birthday approached, marking 3 years since the divorce, I realized that our unconventional beginning had evolved into something authentic and beautiful. The crisis that had threatened to destroy my marriage had instead led to the creation of a family structure that served Emma's needs better than the original configuration ever could have. Our bond had deepened through shared challenges and mutual dependence, creating a relationship that felt as natural and permanent as any biological connection. The foundation we'd built during these formative years would prove essential when facing the revelations that lay ahead, though I couldn't have imagined the magnitude of the secrets that remained hidden, or the ways they would ultimately reshape our understanding of the past. Emma's security in our relationship gave her the strength to pursue difficult truths when the time came, while my own growth as a parent prepared me for discoveries that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the circumstances that had brought us together. But in that moment, celebrating Emma's birthday with just the two of us and a small group of her closest friends, the future felt bright and manageable. We had survived the worst that betrayal and abandonment could offer, emerging stronger and more connected than I dared to hope. The man who had brought Emma into my life through his failures as a father had inadvertently given me the greatest gift imaginable, though it would take many more years to fully understand the price Tony had paid for that gift, and the secrets David had taken with him to his grave. Emma stood in my living room last Tuesday afternoon, 27 years old, and carrying a manila envelope that would finally explain why her father had died so suddenly at 45. The forensic accountant I'd watched grow from a frightened toddler into a brilliant, compassionate woman had spent months investigating financial irregularities she'd discovered while auditing a construction company in Seattle. What she'd uncovered wasn't just embezzlement or tax fraud, but a conspiracy that reached back to the years when David was supposedly building his legitimate business empire. She sat across from me in the same chair where I'd once read her bedtime stories, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the envelope and spread its contents across my coffee table. Bank statements, property deeds, insurance policies, and medical records created a paper trail that told a story neither of us had suspected. The man we'd both known as David Mitchell had been living under an assumed identity for the last 15 years of his life, and the heart attack that killed him hadn't been natural at all. "I need to tell you something about the company I've been auditing," Emma began, her voice carrying the careful precision she used when dealing with particularly complex financial crimes. "Cascade Construction went bankrupt 3 years ago, but during the asset recovery process, I found irregularities in their historical records that didn't make sense. Shell companies, offshore accounts, payments to entities that didn't seem to exist." She pulled out a series of bank statements dating back to when Emma was still in elementary school. These accounts were all controlled by someone using David Mitchell's social security number, but the signature cards and identity verification documents show a different person entirely. The real David Mitchell died in a car accident in Nevada in 1992, 2 years before Dad started using his name. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, forcing me to grip the arms of my chair as the implications washed over me. The man I'd married, divorced, and spent 15 years trying to understand had been a complete fabrication. Emma's father, the person whose callousness toward Tony had shaped so much of our family's story, had literally been someone else entirely. Who was he really? I managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Emma reached for another set of documents, these bearing the letterhead of a private investigation firm I didn't recognize. His real name was Robert Castellanos. He grew up in Phoenix, dropped out of high school, and spent his early 20s moving between cities and working construction jobs under various identities. The pattern suggests he was running from something, though I haven't been able to determine what yet. The photographs she showed me were surveillance images taken in the months before David's death, captured by investigators who'd been tracking financial irregularities connected to several construction companies across the Pacific Northwest. The man in the photos was recognizably David, but seeing him through the lens of criminal investigation transformed my perception of every interaction we'd ever had. "The heart attack wasn't natural," Emma continued, her voice becoming steadier as she moved into the technical details that were her professional expertise. "I found communications between Robert and someone he was apparently trying to blackmail, threatening to expose their involvement in the Shell Company network unless they increased his payments. The medical examiner's report mentions elevated levels of digitalis in his blood, but it was attributed to prescription heart medication." She handed me a toxicology report that had been buried in supplementary files, apparently overlooked during the initial investigation. "Digitalis poisoning can mimic natural heart failure, especially in someone with a history of minor cardiac irregularities. The amounts found in his system were consistent with therapeutic use, but the timing suggests they were administered all at once rather than as part of ongoing treatment." The methodical way Emma presented this information reminded me of the careful, systematic approach she'd always taken to understanding complex problems. Even as a child, she'd possessed an unusual ability to see patterns and connections that others missed, a trait that had served her well in her chosen profession and was now providing answers to questions I'd never thought to ask. "I think someone killed him to stop him from exposing their financial crimes," she said quietly. "The blackmail communications stop abruptly 3 days before his death, and there's a wire transfer of $50,000 to an account in his name that was never claimed. It looks like a payoff that went wrong." The documents she'd assembled painted a picture of systematic financial manipulation spanning multiple companies and jurisdictions. Robert Castellanos, operating as David Mitchell, had apparently been involved in laundering money through construction contracts, creating fake entities to justify payments, and skimming profits from legitimate projects. His role seemed to be that of a mid-level facilitator, rather than a mastermind. But his knowledge of the operation's details had made him valuable, and ultimately dangerous. "There's something else," Emma said, reaching for a file I hadn't noticed before. "I found records of payments to Tony Chen that continued for 6 months after she died. Someone was using her identity to collect money from the same accounts that were funding Robert's activities." This revelation was perhaps the most shocking of all, suggesting that Tony's death might not have been the simple overdose everyone had assumed. If someone had been impersonating her to collect payments, it meant her identity had value to the criminal network Robert had been involved with. The possibility that she'd been murdered for her connection to these financial crimes added another layer of tragedy to Emma's origin story. "I think Tony found out about the fake identity and the money laundering," Emma continued, her voice becoming more confident as she worked through the logical connections. "The timing of her death coincides with a major expansion of the shell company network. If she threatened to expose Robert or demanded more money for her silence, she would have become a liability." The medical records Emma had obtained through channels I didn't want to know about showed that Tony had contacted a lawyer 3 weeks before her death, apparently seeking advice about quote, irregularities in child support payments. The lawyer, now deceased, had made notes about a client who claimed her ex-boyfriend was using a false identity and wanted to know her legal options for reporting financial crimes. "She was trying to protect me," Emma said, tears forming in her eyes for the first time during our conversation. "She discovered that the man she thought was my father was actually a criminal using someone else's name, and she was trying to figure out how to get me away from him safely." The picture Emma was constructing explained so much about Tony's desperation in those final letters, the increasing urgency of her pleas for help, and her growing fear for both their safety. She hadn't been an unstable woman demanding money from an ex-lover. She'd been a young mother who discovered that her child's father was a dangerous criminal and was trying to navigate an impossible situation without resources or support. "The overdose was probably forced," Emma continued, showing me evidence that the drugs found in Tony's system had been administered in a way that was inconsistent with voluntary use. Someone wanted her silenced permanently, and they made it look like she'd relapsed into addiction to avoid investigation. The systematic destruction of 2 lives to protect a money laundering operation was almost too monstrous to comprehend. Tony had died because she'd tried to protect her daughter from a man she'd discovered was living under a false identity. Robert had died because his greed had made him attempt to blackmail people who were willing to kill to protect their secrets. "There's one more thing," Emma said, pulling out a document that made my blood run cold. "I found a life insurance policy taken out on you 6 months before Robert's death. He was the beneficiary, and the policy was worth $2 million. I think he was planning to have you killed next." The insurance policy was legitimate, purchased through a company I'd never heard of and signed with what appeared to be my own signature. The medical examination requirements had apparently been waived due to my age and health status, though I had no memory of completing any paperwork or undergoing any health screenings. The realization that Robert had been planning my murder was terrifying enough, but the professional competence with which he'd arranged the false documentation suggested this wasn't his first attempt at such a scheme. "His death probably saved your life," Emma said softly. "Whoever killed him disrupted his plans, though they almost certainly weren't trying to protect you. They just wanted to eliminate someone who was becoming too greedy and too careless." I sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation that the past 25 years of my life had been built on foundations that were completely different from what I'd believed. The man I'd married had been a criminal, operating under a stolen identity. Emma's mother had been murdered for trying to protect her daughter. The abandonment and callousness I'd attributed to David's character flaws had actually been the calculated indifference of someone for whom human relationships were merely tools for manipulation. "Why are you telling me this now?" I finally asked. "What changed?" Emma reached for one final document, this one bearing the seal of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. "Because I reported everything to the federal authorities 6 months ago, and they've been building a case against the people who were running the money laundering network. They need witnesses who can testify about Robert's activities and his relationship with the other conspirators. The investigation had expanded far beyond the initial construction company audit, encompassing multiple states and involving crimes spanning 2 decades. Robert's murder had actually been one of several that occurred when the network began eliminating lower-level participants who knew too much about the operation. The people responsible were finally being held accountable, but the process would require Emma and me to relive the most painful aspects of our shared history. "I wanted you to know the truth before the FBI contacted you directly," Emma explained. "They'll want to interview you about your marriage to Robert, about any suspicious activities you might have witnessed, about the insurance policy, and any other attempts he might have made to manipulate your financial situation." The prospect of testifying about my relationship with a man who had never actually existed was surreal and disturbing. Every memory I had of David would need to be re-examined through the lens of his true identity and criminal activities. The betrayal I'd felt when I discovered his abandonment of Tony would be dwarfed by the revelation that our entire relationship had been a criminal's cover story. "There's something I need you to understand," I said to Emma, reaching across the table to take her hands. "None of this changes anything about us. You're my daughter in every way that matters. And that truth exists independently of whatever crimes Robert committed or whatever lies he told us." Emma's smile was radiant and relieved, the expression of someone who'd been carrying a terrible burden and was finally able to share it with the person she trusted most. "I know, I've always known. But I was afraid that learning the truth about him might change how you felt about me, might make you question whether taking me in was worth all the pain it caused." The irony was profound and heartbreaking. Emma had spent months uncovering evidence that would bring justice for her mother's murder and expose the criminal network that had shaped her early life, but she'd been most worried about how these revelations might affect our relationship. The child who'd been abandoned by a criminal posing as her father was still seeking reassurance that she was worthy of love and protection. "You saved me," I told her, meaning every word. "Not just from Robert's plans, but from a life that was built on lies and manipulation. Finding out who he really was doesn't diminish the joy you've brought to my life. If anything, it makes me more grateful that Tony fought so hard to protect you, and that somehow you ended up where you belonged, despite all the evil that surrounded your beginning." The federal investigation would continue for months, requiring multiple interviews and court appearances that would force us to relive painful memories, while helping prosecutors build their case against the surviving members of the criminal network. The process would be difficult and emotionally taxing, but it would also provide closure and justice for crimes that had been hidden for decades. Emma's decision to pursue the truth, even when it led to disturbing revelations about her father's identity and her mother's death, demonstrated the courage and integrity that had always defined her character. The frightened toddler who'd arrived on my doorstep 25 years ago had grown into a woman capable of confronting the darkest secrets of her past and finding a way to transform them into justice for other victims. As we sat together, surrounded by evidence of crimes that had shaped our family's history, I felt a profound sense of completion and resolution. The questions that had haunted me about David's callousness and Tony's desperation finally had answers, even if those answers revealed horrors I'd never imagined. The truth was painful, but it was also liberating, freeing us both from the weight of mysteries we'd never been able to solve. "I love you," I told Emma, the words carrying all the gratitude and pride I felt for the remarkable woman she'd become. "I'm proud of you for uncovering the truth, and I'm grateful that you trusted me enough to share it. Whatever happens with the investigation, whatever we learn about the past, we'll face it together." Emma's response was to lean forward and embrace me with the fierce affection that had sustained us through every challenge we'd faced. The little girl who'd clutched a stuffed elephant while her world fell apart had become a woman capable of bringing down criminals and protecting the innocent. The journey from that first night to this moment of revelation had been difficult and sometimes heartbreaking, but it had also been the most meaningful experience of my life. The criminal who'd called himself David Mitchell was dead, his schemes exposed, his victims finally receiving justice. But the family he'd inadvertently created through his crimes lived on, stronger, and more connected than he could ever have imagined. Emma and I had survived his deceptions and emerged with a bond that no criminal conspiracy could break. In trying to use us for his selfish purposes, Robert Castellanos had created something beautiful and permanent that would outlast all his lies. 25 years after I'd opened my door to find a frightened child on my doorstep, that same child had returned with the truth that finally explained why she'd needed saving and why saving her had been the most important thing I'd ever done. The revelation was shocking and painful, but it was also perfect in its completeness, providing answers to questions I'd carried for decades and confirming that every difficult decision I'd made had been exactly right. The FBI field office in downtown Portland felt impossibly sterile as Emma and I sat in the waiting area, 6 weeks after her revelation had shattered everything I thought I knew about our family's history. Agent Rebecca Martinez, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in financial crimes, had been leading the investigation into the money laundering network that Robert Castellanos had operated under David Mitchell's stolen identity. Today marked our third interview, but the first where we would see the complete scope of the criminal enterprise that had shaped our lives. Agent Martinez escorted us to a conference room where the walls were covered with photographs, financial charts, and timeline graphs that mapped out 2 decades of criminal activity. The centerpiece was a large board showing connections between dozens of shell companies, construction firms, and individuals across 7 states. Robert's photograph, labeled with both his real name and the David Mitchell alias, occupied a central position in the web of corruption. Thanks to Emma's initial report and the evidence she uncovered, we've been able to trace this network back to its origins in the early 1990s. Agent Martinez began, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had spent months building an airtight case. What started as a simple identity theft evolved into a sophisticated operation that laundered over $50 million through fake construction contracts and fraudulent real estate transactions. She pointed to a section of the timeline that corresponded to the period when I'd first met Robert at that technology conference in Tokyo. Robert Castellanos assumed David Mitchell's identity in 1994, 2 years after the real David died in Nevada. He spent months studying Mitchell's background, obtaining duplicate documents, and creating a false history that would support his cover story as a successful businessman. The revelation that our entire courtship had been orchestrated by a criminal seeking to establish credibility in legitimate business circles was both horrifying and strangely clarifying. Robert's apparent charm and business acumen hadn't been natural talents, but carefully practiced deceptions designed to convince people like me that he was someone worth trusting and marrying. Your marriage provided him with social credibility and financial legitimacy, Agent Martinez continued, her tone clinical but not unkind. A successful businessman with an accomplished wife attracted less scrutiny than a single man with questionable references and a sparse employment history. You were essentially an unwitting character witness for his assumed identity. Emma reached for my hand as Agent Martinez described how Robert had used our joint bank accounts and property ownership to layer his illicit income with apparently legitimate assets. The construction business he'd claimed to be building from scratch had actually been a front for processing payments from various criminal enterprises, with our family finances serving as another layer of concealment. Tony Chen's involvement was initially limited to her relationship with Robert, Agent Martinez explained, moving to another section of the timeline. But her background as a community college student studying accounting made her useful for maintaining financial records that needed to appear legitimate. We believe she was processing paperwork for several shell companies without fully understanding their criminal purpose. The agent showed us copies of documents in Tony's handwriting, accounting ledgers, and bank reconciliations that demonstrated her skill with numbers and attention to detail. What had appeared to be the scattered work of an unstable young woman was actually evidence of sophisticated bookkeeping for a complex criminal operation. Tony's discovery of Robert's true identity appears to have occurred when she noticed discrepancies in Social Security records while preparing tax documents for one of the shell companies. Agent Martinez continued. She found documentation showing that David Mitchell had died in 1992, which meant the man she knew as Emma's father was operating under a stolen identity. The timeline showed that Tony's realization of Robert's deception had coincided with her increasingly desperate attempts to secure financial support for Emma. Her letters, which I'd interpreted as the pleas of an unstable woman, were actually the careful documentation of someone who understood she was dealing with a dangerous criminal and was trying to create evidence that might protect her daughter. We believe Tony was planning to expose Robert's identity theft in exchange for a substantial financial settlement that would allow her to relocate with Emma, Agent Martinez explained. She'd contacted a lawyer and begun gathering evidence, but she underestimated the ruthlessness of the people Robert was working with. The agent showed us surveillance photographs taken in the weeks before Tony's death, images that captured her meeting with various individuals whose identities had now been established through the investigation. The pictures revealed a young woman who appeared frightened but determined, someone who was clearly in over her head but trying to protect her child despite the mounting danger. Tony's murder was carried out by Marcus Volkov, an enforcer who specialized in making deaths appear accidental or drug-related, Agent Martinez said, indicating a photograph of a cold-eyed man in his 50s. Volkov has been linked to at least 12 other deaths connected to this money laundering network. He's currently in federal custody and has agreed to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. Learning that Tony's killer had been identified and captured provided a sense of justice I hadn't expected to feel so intensely. The young woman who had tried so hard to protect Emma deserved better than to be dismissed as another overdose victim, and knowing that her murderer would face consequences for his crimes felt like a small restoration of dignity to her memory. Robert's death followed a similar pattern, Agent Martinez continued, moving to the final section of the timeline. His attempts to blackmail other members of the network had made him a liability, and Volkov was sent to eliminate him as well. The digitalis poisoning was Volkov's signature method, designed to mimic natural heart failure in victims with cardiac risk factors. The revelation that Robert's death had been an execution rather than natural causes was disturbing, but also oddly satisfying. The man who had orchestrated Tony's murder and planned mine had ultimately fallen victim to the same ruthless system he'd helped create. There was a certain poetic justice in his destruction by the criminal network he'd served so faithfully. The insurance policy Robert took out on Sarah was part of a broader plan to eliminate witnesses and loose ends, Agent Martinez explained, showing me documents that detailed the scope of Robert's final scheme. He'd accumulated significant gambling debts and was planning to fake his own death after collecting insurance payouts on both you and Emma. Your murders would have been staged as a murder-suicide, with Robert disappearing to a country without extradition treaties. The casual way Agent Martinez described my planned murder was chilling, but also illuminating in terms of understanding Robert's true character. I hadn't been his wife so much as a long-term mark, someone whose death had been planned with the same methodical attention he'd brought to his other criminal activities. Emma's role in unraveling this network had been more significant than I'd initially understood. Her forensic accounting skills had allowed her to trace financial patterns that law enforcement had missed for years, identifying connections between seemingly unrelated shell companies and following money trails that revealed the scope of the criminal enterprise. Emma's analysis provided the breakthrough we needed to understand how the network operated, Agent Martinez said, her admiration for Emma's investigative abilities clearly genuine. Without her work, we might never have connected Robert's activities to the broader conspiracy or identified the people responsible for Tony's murder. The investigation had ultimately resulted in the arrest of 17 individuals across multiple states, with charges ranging from money laundering and tax evasion to murder and conspiracy. The network's leadership, a group of businessmen who had used construction contracts to launder proceeds from drug trafficking and human smuggling, faced sentences that would effectively end their criminal careers permanently. The civil asset forfeiture process has recovered approximately $37 million in cash and property, Agent Martinez explained, showing us a list of seized assets that included luxury homes, vehicles, and offshore bank accounts. A significant portion of these funds will be returned to victims of the network's crimes, including compensation for Tony's family and educational funds for other children who were affected by their parents' involvement. The prospect of financial compensation felt almost irrelevant compared to the satisfaction of knowing that justice was being served and that other potential victims would be protected. But Agent Martinez explained that the recovered funds would also support programs for children who had been orphaned or abandoned due to their parents' criminal activities, extending the benefits of Emma's investigation to families we would never meet. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," Agent Martinez said, her tone becoming more personal. "The investigation has revealed that Robert Castellanos wasn't his real name either. The man you knew as David Mitchell was actually born Anthony Russo in Phoenix, Arizona. He'd been using false identities since he was 18, when he fled Arizona to avoid prosecution for assault charges related to domestic violence. This final revelation completed the picture of a man whose entire adult life had been built on deception and violence. The person I'd married had never existed in any meaningful sense. A complete fabrication created by someone whose true character was defined by brutality and selfishness. Understanding this helped explain the emotional emptiness I'd sensed in him, the inability to form genuine connections that had characterized all his relationships. Anthony Russo had a pattern of targeting educated, financially stable women who could provide legitimacy for his various schemes," Agent Martinez continued. "Before you, there were at least 3 other women who had relationships with him under different identities. 2 of them died under suspicious circumstances after they became inconvenient to his plans. The realization that I'd narrowly escaped becoming another victim in a serial pattern of exploitation and murder was both terrifying and sobering. My decision to take in Emma had likely saved both our lives by creating complications that disrupted Anthony's ability to simply dispose of me when I was no longer useful to his criminal activities. Emma's presence in your household created witnesses and emotional attachments that made you more difficult to eliminate quietly," Agent Martinez explained. "Anthony preferred to avoid unnecessary attention, and killing a woman who had recently adopted a young child would have generated the kind of investigation he wanted to avoid. Emma had literally saved my life by existing, by creating a family structure that was too visible and too emotionally complex for Anthony to dismantle without risking exposure. The child who had arrived as evidence of my husband's betrayal had actually been my protection against his ultimate plans for my destruction." As our interview concluded, Agent Martinez provided us with information about the ongoing legal proceedings and the likelihood that we would be called to testify in several of the upcoming trials. The process would continue for at least another year, but the most dangerous elements of the network had been dismantled, and the surviving members were either in custody or had agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. Walking out of the FBI building into the crisp Portland afternoon, Emma and I found ourselves in the strange position of having solved mysteries we'd carried for decades, while creating new questions about identity, justice, and the nature of family bonds. The man who had brought us together through his crimes was dead, his co-conspirators facing justice, and his victims finally receiving acknowledgement of the injustices they'd suffered. "I keep thinking about all the what-ifs," Emma said as we walked toward my car. "What if Tony hadn't discovered his real identity? What if she hadn't been murdered? What if you hadn't taken me in?" These were the same questions that had been haunting my thoughts since learning the truth about Anthony Russo's criminal activities and the systematic way he'd manipulated everyone around him. But rather than dwelling on alternative histories, I found myself focusing on the remarkable series of circumstances that had ultimately led to justice and resolution. "I think Tony saved us both," I replied, meaning every word. Her courage in investigating Anthony's identity and trying to expose his crimes created the evidence trail that Emma was able to follow 25 years later. She protected you by documenting everything, even though she paid the ultimate price for her bravery. The drive home took us through the neighborhoods where Emma had grown up, past the schools she'd attended, and the parks where we'd spent countless hours building the relationship that had sustained us through every challenge. The familiar sights had new meaning now, representing not just personal memories, but evidence of a family that had survived criminal conspiracy and emerged stronger than before. "There's something I've been wanting to tell you," Emma said as we pulled into my driveway. "During the investigation, I learned that Tony had been keeping a journal about me, documenting my development and her hopes for my future. The FBI recovered it from evidence storage, and they're going to return it to us once the trials are completed." The prospect of reading Tony's thoughts about Emma and her dreams for their shared future was both heartbreaking and wonderful. After 25 years of wondering about the woman who had given birth to my daughter, I would finally be able to understand her perspective and learn about the love she'd felt for the child she'd tried so hard to protect. I also want you to know that everything we've learned about Anthony and his crimes has only made me more grateful for the choice you made to keep me," Emma continued. "You could have let social services place me elsewhere, could have protected yourself from all the complications my presence created. Instead, you chose love over convenience, and that choice ultimately saved both our lives." Standing in my driveway, looking at the woman Emma had become despite the criminal circumstances of her origin, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride and completion. The frightened toddler who had arrived with nothing but a stuffed elephant had grown into someone capable of bringing down a criminal network and ensuring justice for her murdered mother. The journey from that first night to this moment of resolution had been difficult and sometimes dangerous, but it had also been the most meaningful experience of my life. The federal trials would continue for months, requiring us to relive painful memories while helping prosecutors ensure that Anthony's co-conspirators faced appropriate consequences for their crimes. But the most important work was already complete. Emma had uncovered the truth about her parents' deaths, exposed a criminal network that had operated with impunity for decades, and brought justice to victims whose cases had been forgotten by everyone except their families. Most importantly, we had confirmed that the bond between us was strong enough to survive any revelation about the past. The love that had sustained us through 25 years of challenges would continue to sustain us through whatever the future might bring. We were family not because of the circumstances that had brought us together, but because of the choices we had made to protect and support each other despite those circumstances. As we walked toward the house where Emma had grown up, where she'd learned to feel safe and loved despite the trauma of her early years, I realized that Anthony Russo's greatest failure hadn't been getting caught by federal investigators. His greatest failure had been underestimating the power of genuine love to transform even the most devastating betrayals into unexpected blessings. In trying to use us for his selfish purposes, he had created something beautiful and permanent that would outlast all his crimes. The little girl who had needed saving had become the woman who ensured that justice was finally served. The criminal who had thought himself clever enough to fool everyone had been exposed by the very child he'd abandoned. And the family he'd inadvertently created through his deceptions had not only survived his schemes, but had played a crucial role in ensuring that his victims received the justice they deserved. 25 years after opening my door to find a frightened child carrying a stuffed elephant, I understood that every difficult decision I'd made had been exactly right. Emma was my daughter in every way that mattered, and together we had not only survived Anthony Russo's criminal conspiracy, but had ensured that his legacy would be justice, rather than continued suffering for his victims. 1 year after the federal trials concluded with the conviction of all 17 conspirators in Anthony Russo's criminal network, Emma and I stood in the cemetery where Toni Chen had been buried 26 years earlier. For the first time since her death, Toni's grave bore a proper headstone, paid for with funds recovered from the criminal enterprise that had destroyed her life. The inscription read simply, "Teresa Toni Chen, beloved mother, brave protector, justice served." Emma placed a bouquet of white roses on the grave while I stood silently beside her, both of us finally able to grieve properly for the woman whose courage had ultimately saved our lives. The journal Toni had kept during Emma's infancy, returned to us after the trials, had revealed a young mother's profound love for her daughter and her growing fear as she realized the danger they were both in. "She knew," Emma said softly, her voice carrying the wonder of someone who had spent months reading her mother's private thoughts. "She knew from the beginning that something was wrong with Anthony. She wrote about how his stories never quite matched up, how he seemed to have no real history or permanent connections to anyone." The journal entries, written in Toni's careful handwriting, painted a picture of a perceptive young woman who had initially been charmed by Anthony's apparent sophistication, but gradually became suspicious of inconsistencies in his behavior. She had documented everything with the precision of someone who understood that she might need evidence to protect herself and her child. "Listen to this entry from 2 weeks before I was born," Emma said, pulling out a photocopy of one of the journal pages. "I'm scared about what kind of man is going to be my baby's father. David changes his story about his childhood every time I ask questions. Yesterday he said he grew up in Colorado, but last month it was Utah. When I mentioned the discrepancy, he got angry in a way that felt dangerous. Reading Tony's observations about Anthony's deceptive nature was both heartbreaking and illuminating. She had recognized his fundamental dishonesty, but had been trapped by her pregnancy and lack of resources, unable to safely distance herself from a man she increasingly understood to be dangerous. The last entry is from 3 days before she died, Emma continued, her voice becoming steadier as she moved into the territory we'd covered many times over the past year. She wrote that she'd found proof David wasn't who he claimed to be, and that she was going to use that information to make sure I was protected from whatever he was really involved in. The federal investigation had confirmed that Tony's discovery of Anthony's identity theft had triggered the events leading to her murder. She had been methodical in gathering evidence, creating copies of documents and correspondence that revealed the scope of his deception. Her planning and documentation had provided the foundation for Emma's investigation 25 years later. She saved us both by being so careful, I said, placing my hand on Emma's shoulder as we stood together in the quiet cemetery. Her courage in documenting everything, even when she knew it was dangerous, created the trail that led you to the truth. The past year had been transformative for both of us, though in different ways. Emma had testified in 7 separate trials, her forensic accounting expertise proving crucial in securing convictions against the entire criminal network. Her work had been featured in federal law enforcement publications and had earned her recognition as one of the country's leading experts in financial crime investigation. More importantly, the process of seeking justice for Tony's murder had given Emma a sense of completion and purpose that had been missing despite her professional success. She had channeled her childhood trauma into a career dedicated to exposing financial crimes, but working on her mother's case had revealed the personal meaning behind her professional calling. I've decided to start a foundation, Emma announced as we walked away from Tony's grave toward the cemetery parking lot. The Teresa Chen Foundation for Families Affected by Financial Crimes will provide support for children who lose parents to criminal violence and help fund investigations into cold cases involving financial fraud. The foundation was a perfect expression of Emma's desire to transform her family's tragedy into protection for other families facing similar circumstances. The federal government's victim compensation program had provided substantial funding, and Emma's growing reputation in financial crime investigation had attracted additional supporters who understood the importance of her work. I want you to be the foundation's first board chair, Emma continued, her request carrying the weight of our shared history and her confidence in my judgment. You understand better than anyone what it means to protect a child who's been abandoned by systems that should have kept them safe. The invitation was both an honor and a natural evolution of the partnership we'd built over 26 years. My experience as an educator, combined with my understanding of the challenges facing children affected by criminal violence, positioned me perfectly to help guide an organization dedicated to serving such families. The foundation's headquarters would be established in Portland, housed in a renovated building in the Arts District that would provide office space for investigators, support services for affected families, and educational programs for law enforcement professionals. Emma's vision was comprehensive, addressing not just immediate needs, but long-term systemic changes that could prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. Our first major case involved a family in Sacramento whose father had been murdered after discovering that his business partner was using their construction company to launder drug money. The widowed mother was struggling to support 3 young children while dealing with financial chaos created by the criminal investigation. Emma's team was able to trace the laundered funds and recover enough assets to provide long-term security for the family. Every case reminds me of our story, Emma told me as we reviewed the Sacramento family's file in the foundation's newly established offices. A parent trying to protect their children, criminals who think they can eliminate problems by eliminating people, and families left to deal with the aftermath of crimes they never knew were happening. The foundation's work expanded rapidly as word spread through law enforcement communities about Emma's unique expertise and the organization's comprehensive approach to supporting affected families. Within 6 months, we were consulting on cases in 12 states and had established partnerships with federal agencies investigating financial crimes with violent components. One of our most significant successes involved a network of fake charity organizations that had been stealing donations while using the funds to support human trafficking operations. Emma's analysis of the financial records revealed connections to 17 separate criminal enterprises across 8 countries. The investigation ultimately led to the rescue of 43 trafficking victims and the recovery of over $6 million in stolen charitable contributions. "This is what Tony died trying to prevent," Emma said as we watched news coverage of the trafficking arrests. Criminals who use legitimate-seeming businesses to hide terrible crimes, and who kill anyone who threatens to expose them. The foundation also established educational programs for young people who had been affected by parental involvement in criminal activities, providing counseling services and academic support, designed to help them overcome the trauma and stigma associated with their circumstances. Many of these children faced challenges similar to what Emma had experienced, requiring careful support to develop healthy relationships and positive self-images. My role as board chair involved overseeing these support programs, while helping to establish protocols for investigating cold cases involving financial fraud and family violence. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply fulfilling, providing a sense of purpose that transformed my understanding of what my life's true calling had always been. "I never imagined that taking you in would lead to all this," I told Emma during one of our regular foundation planning meetings. "You've turned the worst thing that happened to our family into something that's helping hundreds of other families find justice and healing." Emma's response was characteristic of the wisdom she'd developed through years of processing her own trauma while helping others navigate similar experiences. "I think this was always the plan, even if we didn't know it at the time. Tony's courage in fighting Anthony, your courage in keeping me despite everything it cost you, my work uncovering the truth about their deaths. It was all leading to this moment where we could use our experience to protect other people." The foundation's success attracted attention from federal policymakers who were seeking ways to improve support for families affected by financial crimes. Emma was invited to testify before Congress about the need for better coordination between financial crime investigations and victim services, drawing on our personal experience to illustrate the gaps in current systems. When a parent is murdered because they discovered financial crimes, their children face unique challenges that existing support systems aren't designed to address, Emma explained to the Congressional Committee. They're dealing with grief and trauma while also facing financial instability caused by criminal investigations that freeze assets and disrupt normal family income. Her testimony led to the inclusion of family support provisions in federal financial crime legislation, ensuring that future investigations would include protocols for protecting and supporting affected children. The changes were modest but significant, representing the kind of systemic improvements that could prevent other families from experiencing the abandonment and uncertainty that had characterized our early years together. As the foundation's work expanded, Emma and I found ourselves traveling frequently to consult on cases and provide training for law enforcement professionals. These trips often took us to small communities where financial crimes had devastated local families, providing opportunities to see firsthand the impact of the work we were doing. During a consulting trip to a rural Montana town where a bank president had been murdered, after discovering that his institution was being used to launder money for methamphetamine traffickers, we met a family whose experience closely paralleled our own. The victim's widow was struggling to care for 2 young children while dealing with the financial chaos created by the criminal investigation. "I don't know how to explain to my kids why their father had to die," the widow told us, her exhaustion evident after months of navigating legal proceedings while trying to maintain some stability for her children. "He was just doing his job, trying to protect the bank's customers from being victimized by criminals." Emma's response drew on years of experience, helping families process similar tragedies. "Your husband died because he was brave enough to stand up to dangerous people who thought they could operate without consequences. His courage is part of his legacy to your children, even if they're too young to understand it now." The foundation was able to provide immediate financial assistance for the family, while Emma's investigative team worked to trace the laundered funds and recover assets that could provide long-term security. More importantly, we connected the widow with other families who had faced similar circumstances, creating a support network that extended far beyond financial assistance. These personal connections became the foundation's most valuable contribution, linking families who shared the unique experience of losing loved ones to financial crimes, and helping them understand that they weren't alone in their struggle for justice and healing. The relationships formed through these connections often lasted for years, providing ongoing support as families navigated the long process of rebuilding their lives. "This is what I wanted most when I was growing up," Emma told me, as we observed a support group meeting for children whose parents had been killed because of their involvement in exposing financial crimes. "I wanted to know that other people understood what it felt like to lose a parent to violence that seemed so senseless and random." The Foundation's work had given Emma the community she'd never had as a child, while providing her with a platform to ensure that other children facing similar circumstances would have the support and understanding she'd been forced to find on her own. The transformation of her personal tragedy into a source of healing for others represented the kind of redemption that seemed almost too perfect to be real. Our most challenging case involved a family in Detroit whose father had been murdered after discovering that his employer was using false invoices to steal money from government contracts. The complexity of the financial crimes made it difficult to trace the stolen funds, while the family faced ongoing threats from associates of the convicted criminals. Emma spent 3 months in Detroit, working with federal investigators to unravel the financial network, while coordinating with local law enforcement to ensure the family's safety. The case required all of her technical expertise and emotional resilience, but it ultimately resulted in the recovery of enough stolen funds to provide education and support for the victims' 4 children. "Every case teaches me something new about resilience," Emma said as we celebrated the successful resolution of the Detroit investigation. "These families face impossible circumstances, but they find ways to survive and rebuild that remind me why this work matters so much." The Foundation's success had also attracted the attention of international law enforcement organizations dealing with financial crimes that crossed national borders. Emma was invited to consult on cases involving money laundering networks that operated across multiple countries, bringing her expertise to investigations that might otherwise have struggled to identify and trace criminal assets. One particularly significant case involved a network that was using construction contracts to launder proceeds from human trafficking operations across 3 continents. Emma's analysis revealed patterns similar to those she'd identified in Anthony's network, suggesting that the same methodologies were being used by criminal organizations worldwide. "The techniques Anthony used weren't unique to him," Emma explained as she presented her findings to an international law enforcement conference. "These patterns appear in financial crime investigations around the world, which means that developing expertise in one case can provide insights that apply to many others." Her work on international cases had established the Foundation as a leading resource for investigating complex financial crimes involving family violence, bringing recognition and support that enabled us to expand our programs and reach more families in need of assistance. As we approached the Foundation's 2nd anniversary, Emma and I reflected on how far we'd traveled from that Tuesday afternoon when she'd first revealed the truth about Anthony's criminal activities and Tony's murder. The journey from discovery to justice to redemption had transformed both of us in ways we couldn't have anticipated. "I used to think that finding out the truth about my parents would somehow change who I was," Emma said as we stood in the Foundation's offices, surrounded by case files and photographs of families we'd helped over the past 2 years. "But what I learned is that the truth just confirmed what I already knew, that love is stronger than trauma, and that people who choose to protect children can change the world." The Foundation had helped more than 300 families affected by financial crimes, recovered over $30 million in stolen assets, and contributed to the conviction of dozens of criminals who had thought themselves beyond the reach of justice. More importantly, it had created a network of support and understanding for families facing circumstances that most people couldn't comprehend. "Tony would be proud of what you've accomplished," I told Emma as we prepared to leave the office for another family dinner, a tradition we'd maintained throughout all the changes in our lives. "She fought to protect you from Anthony's crimes, and you've used that protection to shield hundreds of other children from similar threats." Walking to my car in the Portland evening, with Emma beside me discussing plans for the Foundation's expansion into victim advocacy training, I marveled at the journey that had brought us to this moment. The frightened toddler who had arrived on my doorstep 27 years earlier had become a force for justice whose work would protect families for generations to come. The criminal who had thought he could use us for his selfish purposes and dispose of us when we became inconvenient had instead created something beautiful and powerful that would outlast his crimes by decades. Anthony Russo's greatest failure hadn't been getting caught. but in underestimating the transformative power of genuine love and the determination of a daughter seeking justice for her murdered mother. As we drove through the neighborhoods where Emma had grown up, past the schools and parks where we'd built the relationship that sustained us through every challenge, I understood that our story had always been leading toward this moment. The pain and uncertainty of those early years had been preparation for the work we were now doing, building strength and resilience that would enable us to help other families survive similar tragedies. 27 years after opening my door to find a child who needed saving, I had discovered that saving her had been the beginning of a mission that would define the rest of our lives. Emma had not only survived the criminal conspiracy that destroyed her early family, she had transformed it into a force for protecting other children and ensuring that criminals like Anthony Russo could never again destroy families with impunity. The legacy of Tony's courage and our love had become something greater than either of us could have imagined, a foundation built on truth and justice that would continue growing long after we were gone. In choosing to protect one frightened child, I had helped create a system that would protect thousands of others, proving that love really can transform even the most devastating betrayals into unexpected blessings. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.